Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're going deep into the 1960s student protests.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a time when you just picture like bell bottoms and protest signs everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And like a whole generation said like, hey, we're going to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
And we're going to use Mr. Hutchings History's overview as our guide for this.
Right.
Now, I knew that the 60s were a time of just major upheaval, but I have a feeling that we're going to find some serious aha moments here as we go along.
What's really fascinating to me about these protests is how they weren't just about youthful rebellion.
Right.
There's this like confluence of social and political and cultural currents that are just swirling around.
Yeah.
And these students weren't just reacting, they were shaping the future.
So it's like they were riding the wave, but also steering the ship at the same time.
Exactly. And to understand this, I think we need to look at the backdrop.
Okay.
College attendance during the 60s just absolutely exploded.
Right.
Went from 22% of young people in 1960 to 35% by 1975.
Wow.
That's massive.
That's a huge
A massive influx of young minds, all concentrated on these campuses, creating this like breeding ground for collective action.
Yeah, it's like suddenly every campus became a potential powder keg.
Right. And this is just a few years after President Kennedy's famous like "ask not" quote in his 1961 inauguration speech.
Oh, yeah.
And Mr. Hutchings actually argues that this wasn't just some nice sentiment.
Right.
Like it directly galvanized young people to engage in social issues.
Mm.
It was like JFK gave him a direct call to action.
Wow, I never realized how much JFK's words might have directly impacted that generation.
Yeah.
And speaking of calls to action, wasn't the civil rights movement happening at the same time?
Absolutely.
Did that play a role?
Absolutely. The civil rights movement provided a working model for student activism.
Okay.
These students had seen the power of direct action firsthand.
Right.
Sit-ins, marches, boycotts, and they began applying these tactics to their own causes.
Mm-hmm.
Take, for example, the 1960 protests against the House Un-American Activities Committee,
HUAC.
HUAC, in San Francisco.
Wait, HUAC, wasn't that the committee that was all about rooting out communists during the Red Scare?
Yes. And they were known for targeting activists and civil rights leaders.
Right.
Thousands of students saw this as an infringement on free speech, and they took to the streets in protest.
Okay.
It was an early sign of their growing willingness to challenge authority head-on.
So they were connecting the dots between civil rights and the right to dissent.
Yeah.
Okay, then things really heat up at Berkeley in 1964, right?
Yeah.
I mean, trying to ban political leaflets on a university campus?
I know.
That's like trying to stop birds from singing.
Right.
What were they thinking?
It seems almost absurd in hindsight, right?
Yeah.
But for the students, this was a blatant attack on their right to free speech and their ability to participate in the political discourse.
So it wasn't just about the leaflets themselves. It was about having a voice being heard.
Exactly. And this is where Mr. Hutchings makes a really interesting point.
Okay.
He argues the students began to see universities not just as places of learning,
Right.
but as cogs in a larger system. What President Eisenhower had called the military-industrial complex.
Right.
That they wanted to challenge.
Okay, hold on. I've heard that phrase before, military-industrial complex. But what does it actually mean?
It essentially refers to the close relationship between the government, the military, and the defense industry.
Okay.
And students saw universities as being complicit in this system, especially with research funding coming from the military.
Mm-hmm.
The ban on leaflets was just a symptom of a much deeper issue for them.
Makes sense. So they were starting to see the bigger picture.
Right.
And this is where Mario Savio enters the scene, right?
Right.
He was a leader of the free speech movement at Berkeley and had some incredible speeches from what I've read.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Savio had a way of capturing the frustration and idealism of the student body. In one speech, he compares the university to a dehumanizing machine.
Wow.
Which really resonated with students who felt like they were being treated as cogs in that very system.
Right. And then there's that iconic slogan, "Don't trust anyone over 30.
Yeah.
That's pure generational clash right there.
It is.
It's like they were drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah, it definitely tapped into a feeling of disconnect
Yeah.
between the younger generation and the establishment.
Right.
Students felt ignored and marginalized.
Yeah.
And Savio's rhetoric gave voice to their anger and their yearning for a more just and equitable world.
So Berkeley was like a spark that ignited a wildfire.
Exactly. Protests demanding greater student power and autonomy
Right.
erupted on campuses across the nation.
Wow.
It became a wave of student activism that was impossible to ignore.
Then we come to Columbia University in 1968.
Yes.
I know students there were furious about the university's ties to Vietnam War research.
Right.
Was that the only thing driving those protests?
It was a major factor, especially with the war escalating. Right.
But there was another issue that added fuel to the fire.
Okay.
A proposed segregated gym.
Wait, a segregated gym in 1968?
I know.
I thought segregation was outlawed by then.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But the university had plans to build a gym that would have separate facilities for students and the Harlem community.
Wow.
It was seen as a blatant act of racism and discrimination.
So the students were dealing with a double whammy.
Yeah.
The university's involvement in the war and this issue of racial injustice in their own backyard.
Exactly. And these two issues became intertwined,
Okay.
reflecting the growing interconnectedness of social movements at the time.
Yeah.
Students were beginning to see the links between different forms of oppression,
Right.
realizing that the fight for social justice had to happen on multiple fronts.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly isolated incidents were actually connected to a much larger struggle for equality and justice. It wasn't just about leaflets or gyms. It was about something much deeper, precisely. And the response to these protests, particularly at Columbia, only intensified the situation.
What do you mean?
Well, the police response at Columbia was particularly brutal.
Okay.
Students occupied buildings, ransacked offices, and even held administrators hostage.
Wow.
But the police crackdown was seen as excessive
Yeah.
and only served to further alienate the student body.
So instead of calming things down, it just poured gasoline on the fire.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And while the university did eventually abandon the gym project
Okay.
and cut some ties with defense research,
Right.
the tension remained palpable.
Yeah.
It was a clear sign that the relationship between students and the establishment was becoming increasingly fractured.
I can see how these events really set the stage for the anti-war movement to take center stage.
Yeah.
But before we delve into that, let's take a quick pause and recap what we've learned so far.
Okay.
We've seen a massive increase in college enrollment,
Right.
the inspiring words of JFK,
Yep.
the example set by the civil rights movement, and these early sparks of protest at Berkeley and Columbia.
Yeah.
It's clear that the 1960s were a time of tremendous social and political upheaval.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is how these seemingly isolated events were actually all interconnected,
Right.
reflecting a growing awareness of social injustice
Yeah.
and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle.
Yeah.
And each event we examine reveals a little bit more about the complex forces that were shaping this era.
Right.
All right, when we come back, we'll dive deeper into the heart of the anti-war movement
Okay.
and see how it became a defining force of the 1960s student rebellion.
Sounds good. Welcome back. So before the break, we were just starting to see how student activism was gaining momentum, fueled by these issues like free speech and racial injustice.
Yeah,
But as you alluded to, the Vietnam War was about to become a major focal point,
right.
maybe the focal point for a whole generation.
It's interesting, you know, when I think of 60s protests, the Vietnam War is definitely the first thing that pops into my head.
Yeah.
But I'm realizing now that it wasn't just some isolated issue.
That's right.
It was connected to everything else that was brewing at the time.
Yeah.
Civil rights, free speech, the whole idea of challenging authority.
You're exactly right. And to understand how the Vietnam War galvanized students,
Yeah,
we have to remember that it wasn't just some far-off conflict for them.
right.
With the draft in place, it became intensely personal.
Yeah.
The possibility of being sent to fight in a war they didn't believe in
Right.
was a terrifying reality for many young men.
That "hell no, we won't go" chant.
Yes.
It wasn't just a slogan, it was a visceral reaction to a very real threat.
Exactly. And this anti-war sentiment had been simmering for a while. Remember the Student Peace Union,
Yeah.
formed back in 1959, well before the war escalated.
That's right. Mr. Hutchings mentions a massive teach-in at Berkeley in 1965
Oh, yeah.
where something like 20,000 people showed up. That's incredible. I can't even imagine fitting that many people on my college campus.
It speaks to the level of engagement and passion surrounding this issue.
Yeah.
Students are organizing, educating themselves, and mobilizing in unprecedented numbers.
So you've got this groundswell of anti-war sentiment, the draft looming over everyone's heads.
Right.
And then you have these huge protests organized by the MOB,
Yes.
the National Mobilization Committee, to end the war.
Right.
In 1967.
Huge.
Things are really starting to boil over.
Absolutely. These protests drew hundreds of thousands of participants
Wow.
and really marked a turning point in the anti-war movement.
And how can we forget Abby Hoffman trying to levitate the Pentagon?
Right.
Talk about creative protest tactics. That must have been quite a sight.
It definitely captured the media's attention.
Yeah.
And while it might seem outlandish to some,
Right.
it reflects the blend of political activism and countercultural experimentation
Yeah.
that characterized the era. But there's a darker side to this story as well.
Uh-huh.
As the war dragged on and frustration grew,
Right.
some protests became more radical
Mm-hmm.
and unfortunately more violent.
You're talking about the bombings and vandalism that started happening in the late 60s.
Yes, while it's important to remember that the vast majority of protests remained peaceful,
Of course.
these acts of violence created a backlash
Yeah.
and alienated some moderate Americans.
Yeah.
The war was tearing the country apart,
Yeah.
and this division was reflected within the anti-war movement itself.
It's like the movement was caught between this powerful idealism
Right.
and the harsh realities of a brutal war.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these major events: the free speech movement, the Columbia University occupations, the massive anti-war protests,
Right.
and this growing tension within the movement itself.
Yeah.
But what was the lasting impact of all of this?
Right.
Did these protests actually achieve anything concrete?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, historians have some different takes on how effective these protests were
I bet.
and what their ultimate legacy is.
Okay, lay it on me. What are some of the main schools of thought on this?
Well, first you have what are called the progressive historians,
Okay.
who argue that the protests played a crucial role in ending the Vietnam War
Okay.
and challenging the power structures of the time.
Mm.
They see it as a victory for grassroots activism,
Yeah.
proof that ordinary people can make a difference when they come together.
So for them, it's a story of triumph over adversity.
Yes.
David taking on Goliath and winning.
In a way, yes.
Okay.
They emphasize the courage and idealism of the students who took to the streets,
Right.
risking their freedom and even their lives to speak truth to power.
That's inspiring, but I'm guessing not everyone agrees with that assessment.
Right. Then you have what's called the institutionalist perspective.
Okay.
They're a bit more critical.
Yeah.
They acknowledge the energy and passion of the movement, but point to a lack of long-term organization and clear goals as major limitations.
So they're saying all that energy and passion might have fizzled out without a more strategic approach?
Exactly. They argue that without sustained organization,
Yeah.
the movement's gains could be easily reversed or co-opted by the establishment.
Right.
They point to the fact that many of the underlying issues that fueled the protests,
Yeah.
economic inequality, racial injustice, militarism,
Right.
remain unresolved today.
That's a sobering thought. So while the protests might have achieved some short-term victories,
Right.
they weren't able to bring about lasting systemic change.
That's their main critique.
Okay.
Now, cultural historians offer a different perspective. They focus on the broader cultural shifts that these protests helped to bring about. They argue that the 1960s counterculture, with its rejection of traditional values
Right.
and embrace of individual expression,
Yeah.
had a profound impact on American society,
Right.
regardless of specific policy changes.
So it's less about concrete wins and more about a shift in consciousness.
Exactly. Think about the impact on music, fashion, art,
Right.
and even attitudes toward authority and social norms. The 1960s counterculture challenged the status quo in profound ways and continues to influence us today.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. It's like those protests planted seeds that are still blooming decades later.
Yeah.
But you said there was one more perspective.
Yes, the realist view.
Okay.
This perspective acknowledges the importance of the issues raised by the protesters,
Right.
but argues that the movement's turn towards violence in the late 60s ultimately backfired, creating a backlash that benefited conservative forces.
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier. So they're saying that the radical fringe of the movement might have actually hurt the cause in the long run.
That's their argument. They point to figures like Richard Nixon and the rise of the silent majority,
Right.
who felt alienated by the upheaval
Right.
and longed for a return to law and order.
It's fascinating how a movement that started with such hope and idealism
Right.
could end up contributing to the rise of the very forces it was trying to oppose.
It's a reminder that social change is complex and messy, and rarely follows a straight line.
Yeah.
There are always unintended consequences, even with the best of intentions.
Right.
But it's also important to remember that these different interpretations aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay.
They can all contribute to a richer understanding of this pivotal period in American history.
Okay, so we've got these different interpretations of the movement's effectiveness and its legacy.
Right.
But let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
What were some of the concrete outcomes of this tumultuous decade?
Okay.
Did the student movement actually change anything?
Well, there were some significant policy changes.
Okay.
The Vietnam War did eventually end, and the power of the draft was greatly diminished. These were hard-won victories directly linked to the relentless pressure from the anti-war movement.
So on those two fronts, at least the movement achieved its goals.
Yes, but it's important to remember that those victories came at a great cost.
Right.
Thousands of American soldiers and countless Vietnamese civilians lost their lives.
Of course.
The war left deep scars on both nations, scars that are still felt today.
That's a crucial point. Even in victory, there's always a price to pay.
Yes.
What about those broader cultural shifts we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
Did the counterculture ethos have any lasting impact?
Absolutely. The 1960s saw a profound shift in attitudes towards authority, individual rights, social justice, and environmental awareness. These changes weren't limited to college campuses.
Right.
They permeated American society as a whole.
Can you give me some examples of how this played out?
Well, think about the ongoing struggles for racial equality, LGBTQ plus rights, gender equality, and environmental protection.
Oh.
These movements are all deeply rooted in the activism and idealism of the 1960s.
Yeah.
The protests of that era helped to create a climate where these issues could be openly discussed and challenged.
It's amazing to think that a generation of young people, armed with little more than their voices and their ideals, could have such a profound impact on the world.
It's a testament to the power of collective action, the importance of speaking truth to power, and the enduring belief that a better world is possible.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that the 1960s were a time of intense conflict and division.
Right.
The backlash against the counterculture contributed to the rise of conservative movements in the following decades.
So while the 1960s brought about significant progress,
Right.
it also sowed the seeds for future cultural and political conflicts.
Exactly. The legacy of the 1960s is complex and multifaceted.
Yeah.
It's a story of both triumph and tragedy, of hope and disillusionment, of progress and backlash.
Right.
And it's a story that continues to unfold today as we grapple with many of the same issues that fueled the protests of that era.
Wow, what a journey through history.
I know.
We've covered so much ground, from the early sparks of student activism to the massive anti-war protests, from the different historical interpretations to the lasting impact of the counterculture.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is.
And while we've reached the end of Mr. Hutchings' overview,
Right.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore about this fascinating and pivotal period in American history.
I completely agree. Before we wrap up, I'd love to dig a little deeper into how the legacy of the 1960s continues to shape our world today.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that, like, the echoes of those protests are still reverberating through our society today.
They really are.
But what are some concrete examples of this enduring influence?
Well,
What threads connect the 60s to the issues we're grappling with right now?
I think a good way to think about it is that the 1960s protests were like a masterclass in activism. You know, movements like the environmental movement, the
Yeah.
feminist movement,
Yeah.
even contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter.
Right.
They all draw inspiration from the tactics and strategies that student activists pioneered back then.
It's like they wrote the playbook for how to organize,
Yeah.
mobilize, and capture the public's attention.
So it's not just about the specific issues they were fighting for, but the methods they used to fight.
Precisely.
Okay.
They showed the power of grassroots, organizing direct action, and using creative tactics to get media coverage and sway public opinion.
Right, like those images of students sitting at lunch counters or
Absolutely.
linking arms to block bulldozers.
Exactly.
Those visuals had a huge impact.
Huge impact. And it wasn't just about the tactics.
Right.
It was also about the spirit of those protests.
Yeah.
That unwavering belief that ordinary people could challenge injustice and demand a better world.
Right, that spirit of idealism and activism is a powerful legacy that continues to inspire new generations of changemakers.
Absolutely. And what's really striking is how the issues that fueled those protests are still relevant today.
Right.
We're still wrestling with questions of social justice, economic inequality, war, and peace, the role of government in our lives.
Yeah, it's like some things never change.
It's like some things never change.
But some things do change, right?
Of
I
course.
mean, we've come a long way since the 1960s in terms of civil rights,
Absolutely.
civilians' rights.
Without a doubt. And those advances are directly linked to the struggles of those who came before us.
Right.
But progress isn't a destination. It's a journey.
Right.
And while we've made strides, there's still so much work to be done.
It makes you wonder what issues today might spark a similar wave of youth activism? What are the things that are keeping young people up at night?
Well, climate change is a huge one.
Yeah.
Young people are on the front lines of this crisis, and they're demanding action from leaders who they see as dragging their feet.
Right.
We're seeing a global youth climate movement emerge with figures like Greta Thunberg inspiring millions to take to the streets.
It's incredible to see their passion and determination. They're not waiting for permission to lead.
Right.
They're demanding change now.
Exactly. And it's not just about climate change.
Right.
We're also seeing young people mobilize around issues like gun violence, racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights, economic inequality.
Yeah.
They're using social media to organize, raise awareness, and pressure those in power to address these systemic issues.
It's like the spirit of the 1960s is alive and well, just finding new expressions in the 21st century.
Exactly. And as we grapple with the challenges of our time, it's worth reflecting on the lessons of the 1960s, both the successes and the failures.
So what are some key takeaways from that era of intense activism? What can we learn from those who came before us?
Well, first and foremost, they showed us the power of collective action.
Yeah.
When people come together with a shared purpose,
Right.
they can create extraordinary change.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that our voices do matter,
Right.
that we don't have to be passive observers of history. We can shape it.
That's so empowering, but it's not enough to just show up for a rally or post something on social media, right?
Right. Another key lesson is the importance of persistence. Social change rarely happens overnight.
Yeah.
It requires sustained effort, strategic planning,
Right.
and a willingness to adapt as circumstances change. It's about committing to the long haul,
Okay.
staying engaged, and holding those in power accountable.
So it's about turning that initial burst of energy into a sustainable movement.
Exactly. And finally, it's crucial to remember that even the most well-intentioned movements can have unintended consequences.
Right.
It's important to be mindful of how our actions might create backlash or division,
Right.
and to always strive for dialogue and understanding, even with those who hold different views.
That's such an important point. It's a reminder that social change is complex and there are no easy answers.
Yeah, but that shouldn't discourage us from striving to create a better world. The 1960s showed us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, it's possible to challenge the status quo and demand a more just and equitable society.
What an incredible deep dive this has been, from the free speech movement at Berkeley to the global climate strikes of today. The 1960s student movement continues to inspire and challenge us. It's a testament to the power of young people to imagine a better future and to fight for it.
It really is.
And as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, it's worth asking ourselves, what issues ignite our passion? What injustices are we willing to challenge? What kind of world do we want to create for ourselves and future generations?
Those are powerful questions to ponder.
They are, and who knows, maybe the seeds of the next great social movement are being planted right now.
Maybe so.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 1960s student revolution.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.